Let us first pray to our Sadguru and then we will start reading of chapters 36 onward. Description of intellect's creation. Om Brahmanandam Paramasukhdam Kevalam Jnanamurtim Danvatītam Gagan Sadrisham Tattvamasiādilakshayam Ekam Nityam Vimalamachalam Sarvadhi Sakshibhutam Bhavatītam Trigunaраhitam Sadguru Tam Namami. So in this chapter 36, in which the description of intellect is there, Ramji said, "Tell me, O Brahman, for the sake of my advancement in knowledge, how does the mundane system exist in the extra-mundane immaterial soul?" Vasishtha replied, "Worlds have no separate existence except in the Supreme Mind. They are all situated in divine consciousness like future waves exist in a sea. As the all-pervading sky cannot be seen owing to its extreme lack of substance, so the undivided nature of the all-pervasive consciousness cannot be perceived on account of its subtlety. As a gem has its own brilliance, whether or not someone moves it, so the unreal world has its potential existence in the divine spirit, both in its state of action and of inactivity. As clouds in the sky don't touch the sky or have a tangible feeling of the sky's emptiness, so the worlds existing in the receptacle of the intellectual soul have no contact with the extraneous intellect, which is unconnected with its contents. As the light residing in the waters of the sea or a pot of water is not connected either with the water or the pot, nor it is felt by us, but by its reflection. So the intangible soul abides unconnected in its receptacle of the body and reflects itself only to our knowledge. Consciousness is devoid of every desire and designation. It is nameless and formless, but our intelligence gives names and forms to its reflections from someone of our intelligible ideas, such as the living soul and the light. Consciousness is clearer than translucent air and finer than it by 100 times. It is known as an undivided whole by the learned, who view it as identical with the whole undivided world, which consciousness comprehends within itself. As seawater shows itself in various forms in all its waves, so consciousness doesn't differ from various representation of its own motion that it shows to us. The diversities of our subjective and objective knowledge of myself and yourself and these are like the varieties of surging waves in the ocean of consciousness. These are false notions because they are only representations of the same element, the very same consciousness. The various states of consciousness, exercise of consciousness, intelligence, and that which is intelligible all belong to the main principle of the soul. They are differently conceived by the learned and ignorant, but the difference is a mere conceit. Consciousness presents two different aspects to wise and unwise people. To the ignorant, it shows its unreal nature in the realistic conception of the world. And to the learned, it exhibits its luminous form in the identity of all things with God. Consciousness, by its internal light, enlightens the luminous bodies of the sun and stars. It gives a relish to things by its internal taste, and it gives birth to all beings from its inborn ideas of them. It neither rises nor sets, nor gets up or sits. It neither proceeds or recedes back and forth. It is not here, nor it is nowhere. The pure and transparent consciousness, which is situated in the soul, displays in itself the phantasmagoria which is called the world. As a heap of fire emits its flame, a luminous body blazes with its rays, and as the sea swells in surges and breaks in with its inlets, so consciousness bursts out in its creation. Thus, consciousness, which is self-manifest and omnipresent of its own nature, develops and envelops the world by its own manifestation and sight, and by its acts of integration and segregation, and its acts of accretion and secretion. By its own error, of its own accord, it is led to forget and forsake its state of infinity. By assuming its individual personality of ego, it is converted to an ignoramus. By its acts of specialization, it falls from its knowledge of generals to that of particulars and comes to make differences between positive and negative, and inclusion and exclusion. It strides and struggles within the confines of the sensuous body, and it multiplies in these bodies like weeds sprouting out of the bosom of the earth. It is consciousness that stretches the spacious vacuum to make room for the subsistence and growth of everything. Consciousness makes the all and ever moving air and the liquid water for the vitality and nourishment of all. It makes the earth firm and fire bright, and the fixed worlds are alone, all alone. It employs time by its injunctions and prohibitions. It gives fragrance to flowers, growing by degrees, their filaments and pistils. It makes the moistures in porous grounds to grow vegetables on earth. The rooted trees bear fruit from their juicy saps beneath, displaying their leaves with outlines in them like their veins and arteries. It renovates the forest with its gifts of various colors and dyes them with the variety of colors from the rainbow of Indra. Consciousness bids the thin layers of rocks, fruits, and flowers to wait upon the flowery season of spring, then brings their fruits to perfection under the heat of summer sun. It makes the dark blue clouds of heaven wait for the approach of rainy weather and causes the harvest of fields to follow in the train of autumn. The cold season is decorated with its smiling frost and its faces of the 10 sides of the sky. Dewy weather is made to blow its icicles of dewdrops on the wings of winter's chilling winds. It makes ever-moving time revolve in its rotation of years and cycles and yuga ages. And it causes the tide of creation to roll on its waves of worlds on its bosom of the ocean of eternity. The decrees of consciousness remain fixed with a wonderful stability, and the earth continues firm with its quality of containing all things. It made the universe abound with 14 kinds of beings, as many worlds. The 14 planes of creation, Chaturdash Bhuvana, these are as different in their modes of life as in their forms and figures. These are repeatedly produced from and reduced to nothing and move in their accustomed courses forever, like bubbles in the waterless ocean of eternity. Here, the miserable multitudes move madly in vain struggles after their desired objects, and in their imbecility under the subjection of disease and death. They are constantly coming to life and going away in their exits, remaining in their living states and acquiring their ends, and forever running back and forth in their repeated births and deaths in this world. With this, chapter 36 comes to an end. In the chapter 37, Upasama, stillness of the soul and apparent activity of the mind is discussed. Now Vasishtha is adding, in this manner, a series of worlds are revolving in their unchanging course, repeatedly appearing and disappearing in the substantiality of Brahma. All this is derived from the one self-existence. All this has become the reciprocal cause of one another by their mutual transformations, and again they are destroyed of themselves by their mutual destructiveness of one another. But as the motion of the waters on the surface doesn't affect the waters in the depth of the sea, so the fluctuations of the changing scenes of nature make no alteration in the ever tranquil spirit of Brahma. As the desert in summer heat presents the water of mirage to the clear sky, so the false world shows its delusive appearances to the mind. As the calm soul seems to be giddy in the state of one's drunkenness, so the essence of consciousness, which is always the same, appears as otherwise in its ignorance. The world is neither a reality nor unreality. It is situated in consciousness, but it appears to be placed outside it. It is not separate from the soul, although it seems to be different from it, as the ornament appears to different from its gold. Ram, that soul of yours, whereby you perceive forms and figures, and sound and smell in the Supreme Brahma, pervading all things. The pure soul, being one in many and inherent in all external objects, can't be thought of as being different from those that appear other than itself. Ram, it is the difference of human thoughts that judges differently of the existence and non-existence of things, and of their good and bad natures also. It judges the world to exist either within or outside the divine spirit, because it is impossible for anything to exist outside the spirit of God. It was the spirit that willed to become many. As there was nothing beside itself which it could think of or find for itself, it was necessarily that it became so of itself without the aid of any extraneous matter. Therefore, The will to do this or that or try for one thing or other doesn't relate to the soul but to the mind. Thus, the soul, without choice, having no will of its own, does nothing except think on what is in itself. It is not an active agent owing to the union of all agencies, instrumentality, and objectivity in itself. It abides nowhere, being both the recipient and content, the container and the contained of everything in itself. Neither is the will-less soul actionless when the acts of creations are perceptible in itself, nor is it possible that there is any other cause of them. Ram, you must know the nature of Brahma to be no other than this, knowing him as no agent and without a second be free from all anxiety. I will tell you more. Though you may continue to do a great many acts here, yet tell me in a word, what do you do that is worth doing? Rely on the lack of your own agency and be quiet, as the voice says. Remain as calm and still as the clear ocean when unshaken by breeze. Know well that it is not possible for the swiftest runners to reach their goal of perfection, no matter how far they may run. You must desist in your mind from pursuing worldly objects and persist to meditate on the spirituality of your inner intellectual soul. This is the main teaching of all teachers, all spiritual teachers of the world. Meditate on the spirituality of your inner intellectual soul. With this, chapter 37 comes to an end, and in chapter 38, the same stillness of spirit and mind as the agent is discussed, in which Vasishtha is resuming as such being the state of the wise, the actions they are seen to do, whether of goodness or otherwise, or pleasurable or painful, and regardless of what they are engaged in, are false and as nothing, and don't affect them as they do other worldly mortals. For what is a person's action other than the exertion of mental and voluntary agencies with a fixed determination and desire of performing some physical acts? The action of man is defined to be the production of an act by appliance of the proper means. The exertion and action of the body in conformity with one's ability and the completion of the effect compatible with one's intention, going together with the enjoyment of the result of such agency. Moreover, whether man is agent or no agent of an action, whether he goes to heaven or dwells in hell, his mind is subject to the same feelings as the desires he has in his heart. Hence, the agency of the ignorant arises from their wishing to do a thing, whether they do it or not, but not so of the wise, who, having no will, are not culpable even for their involuntary actions. Untutored minds are full with the weeds of vice, but well-cultivated souls are quite devoid of them. He who has the knowledge of truth becomes relaxed in his earthly desires. Though he acts his part well, he doesn't look eagerly for its results like others do. He acts with his body, but with a quite unconcerned mind. When successful, he attributes the gain to the will of the God. But the worldly minded, arrogant, the result to themselves, though they couldn't bring it about. Whether the mind intends truly comes to pass, whatever the mind intends truly comes to pass. And nothing is achieved without the application of the mind. Therefore, agency belongs to the mind and not to the body. The world proceeds from the divine mind. The world is development of the mind, and it is situated in the infinite and eternal mind. Knowing all things to be the manifestation of the powers of consciousness, the wise man remains cool to his desires. The minds of those who know the soul come to the state of perfect detachment from their desires. Just as when a false mirage of water is set down by the raining clouds, the particles of the morning dews are dried up by the raging sun, it is then that the soul is set to rest in its perfect bliss, that is Turiya Avastha. This is not the joy of the gusto of pleasure or the pain of sorrow or discontent. It doesn't consist of the liveliness of the living beings or the inertness of stones. It is not situated in the mind in the midst of these opposites, but in the knowing mind, which is all rapture and ecstasy, infinite bliss, Bhumananda. But the thirst of an ignorant mind leads it to the moving waters of earthly pleasures. Just like an elephant is misled to a foul pool where he is plunged in its mud and mire without finding anything that is really good. Here is another example based upon a stanza in the scriptures which says, a man dreaming himself to be falling into a pit feels the fear of his fall in his imagination, even when he has been sleeping in his bed. But another who actually falls in a pit when he is fast asleep is quite unconscious of his fall. Thus, it is the mind which paints its own pleasure and pains, and not the bodily action or its inactivity. Hence, whether a man is the doer of an action or not, he perceives nothing of it when his mind is engrossed in some other thought or action. But he sees everything within himself, who beholds everything in the abstract meditation of his mind. The thinking mind sees outward objects as reflections that are cast out from his pure consciousness. Thus the man, knowing the knowable soul, knows himself to be inaccessible to the feelings of pleasure and pain. Knowing this as a certainty, he finds that nothing exists apart from what is within the container of his soul, which is as minute as a thousandth part of a hair. This being ascertained, he views everything in himself. With this certainty of knowledge, he comes to know his self as a reflection of all things, present in all of them. After these determinations, he comes to the conclusion that he is not subject to pain or pleasure. Thus, freed from anxieties, the mind freely exercises its powers over all customary duties without being concerned about them. He who knows the self remains joyous even in his calamity and shines like the moonlight which enlightens the world. He knows that it is his mind and not his self that is the agent of his actions, although he is the doer of them. Knowing that the mind is the agent in all his actions, he doesn't assume to himself the merit of the exercise of his limbs, hands, and feet, nor does he expect to reap the rewards of all his constant labors and acts. Unrestrained minds become unrestrained agents. Their mental actions become habits, and their endurance brings about the consequences. Thus, the mind is the root of all efforts and exertions of all acts and actions, and of all their results and productions, and the source of the suffering and consequences of actions. By doing away with your mind, you make a clean sweep of all your actions, and thereby avoid all your miseries resulting from your acts. All these are at an end with the trance of the mind is at an end. It is a practice in yoga to relieve the excitement of the mind from its ever-varying purposes. See how a boy is led to the fancy of his mind to build his toy or hobby horse, which he dresses and paints in his willful play without showing any concern or feeling of pleasure or pain in its making or its breaking, however he pleases. So does man build his air castle and level it without any sense of gain or loss. It is by his acting in this manner in all worldly matters that no man is spirituality entangled to them. Amidst the dangers and delights of this world, what cause can there be for your sorrow other than you have the one and not the other? But what is there so delectable and delightful to be desired in this world that at the same time is not impermanent and perishable? Only yourself, your soul, which is neither the active nor the passive agent of your actions and enjoyments, although people attribute actions and their fruitions to it by their acts. The importance of actions and emotions to living beings is a mistake and not veritable truth. If we consider things correctly, we find no action or emotion having any relationship to the soul. Only the sensualist feel attachment or aversion to the senses and conscious actions and enjoyments, and not those who are detached from sensuous affections. There is no liberation in this world for the worldly minded. While liberation is fully realized by the yogi, whose mind in its state of living liberation is free from attachments to the world. Though the sage is established in the light of his self-consciousness, yet he is aware of the distinctions between unity and duality, the true entity from the non-entities, and he sees the omnipotence in all powers that are displayed in nature. To him there is no bond or freedom, no liberation or bondage or whatever, and the miseries of ignorance are all lost in the light of his enlightenment. It is in vain to wish for liberation when the mind is tied down to the earth. So it is redundant to talk of bondage when the mind is already fastened to it. Shun them both by ignoring your individual ego and remain fixed to the true ego. Continue in this way to manage yourself with an unruffled mind on this earth. So with this, chapter 38 also comes to an end, and I think we should stop, or should we take next? In this chapter 39, the Vasishtha postpones the question of impurity from purity, the unity of all things. Ramji replied, "Tell me, O high-minded sage, how could creation proceed from the Supreme Brahma, whom you describe as remaining as still as a painting in the canvas of emptiness?" Vasishtha replied, "O Prince, such is the nature of Brahma that all powers constantly flows from him. Therefore, every power is said to reside in him. In him resides entity and non-entity. In him there is unity, duality, and plurality, and the beginning and end of all things. This is one and nothing else. It is like the sea, whose waters have endless varieties of shapes. It represents the images of myriads of the stars in its bosom, rising spontaneously of them. As consciousness becomes dense, It makes the mind, and the mind brings forth all the powers of thinking, willing, and acting. Then it produces, accumulates, contains, shows, and then absorbs in itself. Brahma is the source of all living beings and of all things seen all around us. His power is the cause that exhibits all things in their constant course or quiescence. All things spring from the Supreme Spirit and they reside in His all comprehensive mind. They are of the same nature as that of their source, like the water of the sweet and salt lakes. Ram interrupted and said, Sage, your discourse is very dark, and I can't understand the meaning of what you are saying. There is the nature of Brahma, which you said to be beyond the perception of the mind and senses. Then what are these perishable things which you say have proceeded from him? If your reasoning comes to this conclusion, then I cannot rely upon it. It is the law of production that anything produced from something is invariably the same nature with that of its producer. As light is produced from light, grain comes from grain, the man is born of man, and all kinds come out of their own kind. Therefore, the productions of the immutable spirit must also be unchangeable and spiritual in their nature. Beside all this, the intellectual spirit of God is pure and immaculate. This creation is all impure and gross matter. Upon hearing these words, the great sage said, Brahma is all purity and there is no impurity in him. The waves moving on the surface of the sea may be foul, but they don't soil the waters of the deep. Ram, you cannot conceive of there being a second person or thing beside the one Brahma, just as you can have no conception of fire beside its heat. Ramji replied, Sage, Brahma is devoid of sorrow, while the world is full of sorrow. Therefore, I can't clearly understand your words. When you say this to be the offspring of that, Valmiki said to Bhardwaj, all these words of Brahma, the great sage Vasishtha remained silent. He stopped his lecture and contemplated. His mind lost its accustomed clarity. Then, recovering its clear vision, he pondered within himself in the following manner. The educated and intelligent mind that has known the knowable, one has reached the end of the subject of liberation by its own reasoning and intuition as that of Ram. It is no fault of the educated to have questions until it is explained to them in their full satisfaction, as in the case of Ram. The half-educated are not fit to receive spiritual instruction because their view of phenomena, which dwells on obvious objects, proves to be the cause of their ruin. But he who has come to understand in a transcendental light and who has a clear insight of a spiritual truth feels no desire for sensual enjoyments and instead advances in course of time to the conclusion that Brahma is all in all things. First, the disciple has to be prepared and purified with the teachings and practice of stillness and self-control. Then he is to be initiated in the creed that all this is Brahma and you are that pure spirit. But whom so teaches the faith of all is Brahma to the half-taught and ignorant truly entangles him in the strong snare of hell. The well-discerning sage should tell only those who are enlightened in their understanding, whose desire of sensual gratifications has abated, and who are free from their worldly desires, who are cleansed of the dirt of their ignorance, and who are prepared to receive religious and spiritual instruction. The spiritual guide who instructs his students without weighing well his habits and conduct is a silly teacher and sinks to hell and has to dwell there until the last day of judgment. The Venerable Vasishtha, who was the chief of sages and like the bright sun on earth, having considered these things, spoke to Ram as follows. Vasishtha said, I will tell you, Ram, at the conclusion of this lecture, whether the attribution of the impurity of gross bodies is applicable to Brahma or not. For now, know that Brahma is almighty, all pervading, omnipresent, and is all in himself. Because of his omnipotence, he can do and become all and everything of itself. You see various practices of magicians and tricks of jugglers in producing, presenting, and hiding many things in the sight of man. These are all only unreal shows. In the same way, Brahma produces, presents, and removes all things from him and into himself. The world is filled with gardens like those in fairylands, and the sky is full with the airy castles of Gandharvas and the hours of gods. Men are seen to descend from the cloudless sky to the surface of the earth and rise upwards to heaven. Fairy cities, like the palaces of the Gandharvas or the ethereal regions, are shown on earth and filled with the fairies of fairyland. Whatever there is or has been, is to be in this world are all like reflections of the revolving sky and heavenly bodies, or a brass ball affixed to the top of a tower and darting its golden light below. All these are only exhibitions of the various forms of manifestation of the self same God. Whatever takes place at any time or in any place and in any form is only a variety of the one self existent reality. Therefore, why, O Ram, should you give vent to your sorrow or joy, or wonder any change of time or place or nature and form of things? They are all full of the Spirit of God and exhibit the endless aspects of the infinite mood. Let the intelligent preserve the sameness of their minds and dispositions amidst all changes, knowing them to be the varying conditions of the same unvarying mind. He who sees his God in all and is filled with equanimity has no cause for surprise, grief, or delight, or any other fluctuation of his mind in response to any change in nature or the ups and downs of his fortune. In all the variations of time and place, and in all external circumstances, the unaltered mind continues to see the varieties of the power of his Maker. The Lord proposes these plans in the formation of his creation and exhibits as the sea does its waves in endless varieties and successions from the fullness of his mind. So the Lord manifests the power situated in himself as the sea does its waves in itself, as the milk forms butter, as the earth produces earthenware, or thread is woven into cloth. The fig tree brings forth its fruit, and all other varied forms are contained in their sources. But these changes in form are phenomena and not real. They are mere appearances of the spectrum, like those of apparitions and phantoms. There is no agent or object, no actor or act or anything which is acted upon, nor is there anything that becomes nothing except by the variety of the one unity. The mind that witnesses the spiritual truths and remains in its calmness, unimpaired and unaffected by external accidents, come to see the light of truth by it himself. If there is a lamp, there is a light also. The sun shining brings the day within him. Where there is a flower, there is its fragrance. So where there is a living soul, there is the knowledge of the world. The world appearing all around is like the light of the soul. It appears like the motion of the wind of which we have no notion of its reality or unreality. The Immaculate Soul is the prime power of the appearance and disappearance of the myriads of cross bodies. Like the revolving stars of the sky and the seasonal flowers of spring appear and reappear to us by turns, like the ups and downs of wheels in motion. All things die away when our souls are without us. But how can anything be nothing when we are in possession of our souls? All things appear before us in the presence of our souls, and they vanish from before us in their absence from the body. Everything is born with us, with our souls, and is lost with the loss of them. The living have all, but the dead are lost to view. The human soul, when joined with the divine, has a clear view of everything. The minds of men are endowed with their knowledge at their very birth. Then growing bigger by degrees in course of time, they expand themselves into the form of this spacious forest of the world. The woods of the world are the fasting post of the soul, where our blooming desires are filled with fruits of poignant grief. It branches out with gratification, blossoms with old age, and is breaking its good post and wandering at large of its free will. Therefore, Ram cut off the tree of the worldly existence with the sword of discrimination. With these words, this chapter 39 also comes to an end, and we will rest our session here itself. This is completed by the grace of Lord Ram, and I pray to the Lord for the next session to happen very soon. Until then, Shivam, friends.